So, I've decided I was watching a few other videos from YouTubers, and I was actually watching some book reviews. I've been doing that a lot this summer. When the idea struck me that they were making a lot of lists. And as you can see, I've grown to like talking. I've grown to like it a lot, actually, for this channel. And they keep playing around with this idea of lists. And usually I just fly into these videos talking out of nowhere just about any old thing. And then I decided, well, you know what? I will make a series of 10 videos. Hopefully, I'll keep up with it. I'm kind of bad with keeping up with things. And I will try to discuss in each video one thing in particular for, a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so, that fundamentally changed my life from, early on until now the most influential things that I can think of that have affected me the most. And some I've tried to round the list out. Like, I have periods, and what happens is these periods, when I become consumed by something, I tend to totally forget what I used to be consumed by, and it can become difficult to remember the really old stuff that I took in, the initial stuff. So, for instance, in high school, I was on a reggae kick. I loved, particular bands a lot then that I don't love now, but I always try to remember that those bands at one point and those artists or those books I was reading then are still just as significant to me as to me now as they were then, because if I had never took in those things, I never would have got led to the stuff that I'm digging now. So it's almost, you can kind of see my life journey through this list I've compiled. So the first mention on the list and the topic of this video will actually be the book of poems by Jim Morrison. Now, a lot of people don't like this book of poems, and a lot of people think that Morrison's poems were crap. They think that it was just a rock star trying to be silly and everything. But for me, it was actually probably the most influential thing. Um, I don't know if I would say the most influential ever. I mean, it's really hard to just pin down one thing, but there's a reason that was the first thing I remembered, and it is actually called Wilderness by Jim Morrison. I have a copy over there on my bookshelf. I'm not going to get up and get it. It's a beautiful book. You can find many of the poems online, and for me, that was really different because it goes back to that one theme that I mentioned again and again. When I saw the two worlds merge and become one, I saw music world merge with poem world. And actually, the way I found the book, I certainly didn't go out and buy it myself. I actually remember a friend of the family had left it here, almost for me to find in a way. And I said, what the hell is this? Jim Morrison, he's that famous singer from The Doors. I've definitely listened to them before. I like them quite a bit. And I picked the book up, and it was just this really intimate look at Jim Morrison's mind, which I just found to be fascinating. I mean, typically these days you don't really, a lot of people didn't like that, but for me, the rock culture is the Big Bang. That's where everything began for me. Without rock and roll, I can assure you and everyone else, and even myself, that I probably never would have found um, any of the other things I went on to find. I never would have probably found an interest in stage act. I mean, I don't act on the stage, but what I mean to say is I have a general interest now in all the art forms, and I formed an appreciation, I'd like to believe, for all of them, even when they're out of my, a lot of people will not even pay attention to certain forms of art, but this book I feel helped me to understand something that probably for me wasn't meant. I always felt I should have never discovered poetry, but this book kind of helped me do that because I saw Jim Morrison as this cool, otherworldly figure, and when I read his book of poems, it just, I was very young. I was probably 12 years old, 13 years old when I read these poems, and some of them are particularly, um, you know, strange. He says strange shit. He's like, like, oh, the cock is crowing in the night or something. And he does a lot of really outrageous stuff. And oftentimes I've said to people that, a lot of people say, oh, I wish I was born back in the 60s. I wish I was born back then so that I could have caught Morrison when he was still around. And to me, I wouldn't ever say that because as cool as it would have been to see Jim Morrison live, the fact for me was it was so cool because these poems, I can assure you, wouldn't have stuck out to me as much had I not found them at the age I found them. It was crucial that I found those poems at 12 years old, because finding them in that way enabled me to, discover a whole other world. And it was really from that one book of poems that I went on to find a great deal of many more things that were very interesting. And in that book, I mean, it was a great journey for me. It was, Wilderness by Jim Morrison. He wrote another book of poems called An American Prayer, I believe, and I've never actually checked that out. And the other thing that was really cool about Morrison's poems was, and I had this CD as well, and I still listen to it from time to time. My favorite song from it was the Ghost song, and he recited some of his poems into the microphone at his studio, not backed by music. And then the surviving members of the Doors, after his demise, went back and they recorded music to accompany the poems. And I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world, man. Nothing was cooler to me than that. Still to this day, I think it's one of the most chilled out albums, one of the most influential albums I have ever heard. It's one of those age old things where no matter it, I call it. I have a lot of stuff now that I put in the what I call the emergency box. For instance, almost all the Beatles records are in the emergency box for me. When I'm really low, when I really need inspiration, when I really just feel like I have nowhere else to turn, and every new thing I pick up, because when you pick up new things, it's always a gamble. You never know if you're gonna love it or if you're gonna hate it. But when you go back to your tried and true old things that you've known that you loved years ago, years past, you know always, hey, this is gonna work. And for me, this book of poems is, to me, I always was fond of saying that every person is like their own universe. And in our universe collectively, the book of Jim Morrison's poems, it's not really a respected book of poems. They don't read it in university. A lot of people degrade it and belittle it and make fun of it and say it's childish and infantile. But in my universe, it might as well be a book of poems by a Greek poet, or by an ancient Roman. It's huge. For my universe, it's like the first poem. It's the first book of poems. It's the Big Bang. It's the first way I discovered everything. Without this book of poetry, that he wrote, I honest to God never would have found my later love for writing songs. I'm sure I never would have found my love for many things. It pushed me forward at a time when I felt young, and I never forgot it. After all these years, I never forgot it, and I always kept my copy. I always had my copy of the book. To this day, I still have it. And I just thought it was the coolest book, man. And in the book, actually, years later, I remember when I first read this poem, I had no idea who he was talking about, but there's a poem in there that he calls Ode to Brian Jones. And at the time I read it, I didn't know who Brian Jones was. In fact, I didn't learn who Brian Jones was, the guitarist for the Rolling Stones, who he also passed away at 27. Um, he was actually the founding member of the Stones. And and it's an ode to Brian Jones. And when I reread it again years later, after I knew who Jones was, after I knew the history behind the Stones, because I didn't actually get into the Stones till much later on in life, after my teenage years, actually. I didn't really look into the Stones. I heard the hits and everything, but I didn't really get into them until my 20s. And, I read that and I said, oh my God, he was writing to Brian Jones. This was an ode to Brian Jones after Brian Jones passed away. And legend has it that when Jim recited the poem at the concert, everyone booed and they made him feel like crap. That's all a big part of Jim's legend, is that like everyone made him feel like crap about the fact that he just wanted to write some poems. But so I just thought that book was always incredible. It meant so much to me. Um, and it was just a great book of poems, and I definitely would urge everyone to check it out. It really is different, and he wrote a lot of other poems, and really that was the basis of the Doors. If you look at interviews that the Doors and the mm, surviving members have given, they all just say, what, Jim was a poet, and that was the end of it. He was really more of it that than a singer. And to this day, I still think, and I've said it before in other videos, that they were the greatest American rock band. and not individual. Dylan Springsteen is individuals, but this they were a band, and the fact that he also released a book of poems to me was the coolest thing in the world. So there you have it. Number one on my list of all time influential art for me is Jim Morrison's Book of Poems, Wilderness.